Colonel Jacobo Árbenz Guzmán, nicknamed the Big Blonde of the Swiss for his Swiss origins, was a Guatemalan military officer who was the second democratically elected president of Guatemala, serving from 1951 to 1954. He was also the Minister of Defense from 1944 to 1951. He was a major figure in the 10-year Guatemalan Revolution, which represented some of the few years of representative democracy in Guatemalan history. The landmark program of agrarian reform Árbenz enacted as president was enormously influential across Latin America. Árbenz was born in 1913 to a middle-class family, son of a Swiss-German father and a Guatemalan mother. He graduated with high honors from a military academy in 1935, and served in the army until 1944, quickly rising through the ranks. During this period, he witnessed the United States-backed dictator George Ubico using the military to brutally suppress agrarian laborers, and was personally required to escort chain gangs of prisoners, a process greatly radicalized him. In 1938 he met and married his wife Maria Villanova, who was a great ideological influence on him, as was José Manuel Fortuny, a Guatemalan communist. In October 1944, several civilian groups and progressive military factions led by Árbenz and Francisco Araragna rebelled against Ubico's repressive policies. In the elections that followed, Juan José Arevalo was elected president and began a highly popular program of social reform. Árbenz was appointed Minister of Defense, and played a crucial role in putting down a military coup in 1949. After the death of Aragna, Árbenz contested the presidential elections that were held in 1950 without any major opponent, and defeated Miguel Ydigoras Fuentes, his nearest challenger, by a margin of over 50%. He took office on March 15, 1951, and continued the social reform policies of his predecessor. These reforms include an expanded right to vote, the ability of workers to organize, legitimizing political parties, and allowing public debate. The centerpiece of his policy was an agrarian reform law, under which uncultivated portions of large land holdings were expropriated in return for compensation, and redistributed to poverty-stricken agricultural laborers. Approximately 500,000 people benefited from the decree. The majority of them were indigenous people, whose forebears had been dispossessed after the Spanish invasion. His policies ran afoul of the United Fruit Company, which lobbied the United States government to have him overthrown. The U.S. was also concerned by the presence of communists in the Guatemalan government, and Árbenz was ousted in the 1954 Guatemalan coup d'etat engineered by the U.S. Department of State and the Central Intelligence Agency. Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas replaced him as president. Árbenz went into a painful exile through several countries, where his family gradually fell apart. His daughter committed suicide, and he descended further into alcoholism, eventually dying in Mexico in 1970. In October 2011, the Guatemalan government issued an official apology for Árbenz's overthrow. Early life. Árbenz was born in Caltenango, Guatemala, the second largest city in the country, in 1913. He was the son of a Swiss-German pharmacist, also named Jacobo Árbenz, who immigrated to Guatemala in 1901. His mother was a Ladino woman from a middle-class family. His family was relatively wealthy and upper-class. His childhood has been described as comfortable. Árbenz inherited his father's Nordic features. At some point during his childhood, his father became addicted to morphine and began to neglect the family business. He eventually went bankrupt, forcing the family to move to a rural estate that a wealthy friend had set aside for them out of charity. Jacobo had originally desired to be an economist or an engineer, but since the family now had no money, he could not afford to go to a university. He did not want to join the military, but there was a scholarship available through the Escuela Politécnica for military cadets. He applied, passed all of the entrance exams, and entered as a cadet in 1932. His father committed suicide 2 years after Árbenz entered the academy. Military career and marriage. Árbenz excelled in the academy and was deemed an exceptional student. He became first sergeant, the highest honor bestowed upon cadets, that only 6 people received from 1924 to 1944. His abilities earned him an unusual level of respect amongst the officers at the school, including Major John Considine, the U.S. director of the school, and of other U.S. officers who served at the school. A fellow officer later said that his abilities were such that the officers treated him with a respect that was rarely granted to a cadet. Árbenz graduated in 1935. After graduating, he served a stint as a junior officer at Fort San Jose in the capital Guatemala City and later under an illiterate colonel in a small garrison in the village of San Juan Zacatepeques. While in San Jose, Árbenz had to lead squads of soldiers which were escorting chain gangs of prisoners to perform forced labor. The experience traumatized Árbenz, who said he felt like a capataz. During this period he first met Francisco Araranga. In 1937, Árbenz was asked to fill a vacant teaching position at the academy. Árbenz taught a wide range of subjects, including military matters, history, and physics. In 1943, he was promoted to captain and placed in charge of the entire corps of cadets. His position was the third highest in the academy and was considered one of the most prestigious positions a young officer could hold. In 1938 he met his future wife Maria Villanova, the daughter of a wealthy Salvadoran landowner. They were married a few months later, without the approval of Maria's parents, who felt she should not marry an army lieutenant who was not wealthy. Maria was 24 at the time of the wedding and Jacobo was 26. Maria later wrote that while the two were very different in many ways, the desire for political change drew them together. Árbenz stated that his wife had a great influence on him. It was through Maria that Árbenz was exposed to Marxism. Maria had received a copy of the Communist Manifesto at a women's congress and left a copy of it on Jacobo's bedside table when she left for a vacation. Jacobo was moved by the manifesto, and he and Maria discussed it with each other. Both felt that it explained many things they had been feeling. Afterwards, Jacobo began reading more works by Marx, Lenin, and Stalin, and by the late 1940s was regularly interacting with a group of Guatemalan communists. October Revolution and Defense Ministership. Historical background. In 1871 the government of Justo Rufino Barrios passed laws confiscating the lands of the native Mayan people, and compelling them to work in coffee plantations for minimal compensation. Several United States-based companies, including the United Fruit Company, received this public land, as well as being exempted from paying taxes. In 1929, the Great Depression led to the collapse of the economy and a rise in unemployment, leading to unrest among workers and laborers. Fearing the possibility of a revolution, the landed elite lent the support to George Ubico, who won the election that followed in 1931, in which he was the only candidate. With United States support, Ubico soon became one of Latin America's most brutal dictators. Ubico abolished the system of debt peonage introduced by Barrios, and replaced it with the vagrancy law, which required all men of working age who did not own land to perform a minimum of 100 days of hard labor. In addition, the state made use of unpaid Indian labor to work on public infrastructure like roads and railroads. Ubico also froze wages at very low levels, and passed a law allowing landowners complete immunity from prosecution for any action they took to defend the property, including allowing landowners to execute workers as a disciplinary measure. The result of these laws was to create tremendous resentment against him among agricultural laborers. Ubico was highly contemptuous of the country's indigenous people, once stating that they resembled donkeys. He gave away 200,000 hectares of public land to the United Fruit Company, and allowed the U.S. military to establish bases in Guatemala. October Revolution. In May 1944, a series of protests against Ubico broke out at the university in Guatemala City. Ubico responded by suspending the constitution on the 22nd of June 1944. The protests, which by this point included many middle-class members and junior army officers in addition to students and workers, gained momentum, eventually forcing Ubico's resignation at the end of June. Ubico appointed a three-person junta led by General Federico Poncevides to succeed him. Although Poncevides initially promised to hold free elections, when the Congress met on the 3rd of July, soldiers held everyone at gunpoint and forced them to appoint Poncevides interim president. The repressive policies of the Ubico administration were continued. Opposition groups began organizing again, this time joined by many prominent political and military leaders, who deemed the Ponce regime unconstitutional. Árbenz had been one of the few officers in the military to protest the actions of Poncevides. Ubico had fired Árbenz from his teaching post at the Escuela Politécnica, and since then Árbenz had been living in El Salvador, organizing a band of revolutionary exiles. Árbenz was one of the leaders of the plot within the army, along with Major Aldana Sandoval. Árbenz was the one to insist that civilians also be included in the coup, over the protests of the other military men involved. Sandoval later said that all contact with the civilians during the coup was through Árbenz. On the 19th of October 1944, a small group of soldiers and students led by Árbenz and Francisco Javier Aranha attacked the National Palace in what later became known as the October Revolution. Aranha had not initially been a party to the coup. However, his position of authority within the army meant that he was key to its success. They were joined the next day by other factions of the army and the civilian population. Initially, the battle went against the revolutionaries, but after an appeal for support, the ranks were swelled by unionists and students, and they eventually subdued the police and army factions loyal to Poncevides. On October 20th, the next day, Poncevides surrendered unconditionally. Árbenz and Aranha both fought with distinction during the revolt, and despite the idealistic rhetoric of the revolution, both were also offered material rewards. Árbenz was promoted from captain to lieutenant colonel, and Aranha from major to full colonel. The junta promised free and open elections to the presidency and the Congress, as well as for a constituent assembly. The resignation of Poncevides and the creation of the junta has been considered by scholars to be the beginning of the Guatemalan Revolution. However, the revolutionary junta did not immediately threaten the interests of the landed elite. 2 days after Poncevides' resignation, a violent protest erupted at Patzisha, a small Indian hamlet. The junta responded with swift brutality, silencing the protest. The dead civilians included women and children. Elections subsequently took place in December 1944, and were broadly considered free and fair, although only literate men were given the vote. Unlike in similar historical situations, none of the junta members stood for election. The winner of the 1944 elections was a teacher named Juan José Arevalo, who ran under a coalition of leftist parties known as the Partido Acción Revolucionaria, and won 85% of the vote. Arango did not wish to turn over power to a civilian administration. He initially tried to persuade Árbenz and Torriello to postpone the election, and after Arevalo was elected, he asked them to declare the results invalid. Árbenz and Torriello insisted that Arevalo be allowed to take power, which Arango reluctantly agreed to, on the condition that Arana's position as the commander of the military be unchallenged. Arevalo had no choice but to agree to this, and so the new Guatemalan constitution, created in 1945, created a new position of commander of the armed forces, a position which was more powerful than that of the defense minister. He could only be removed by Congress, and even then only if he was found to have broken the law. When Arevalo was inaugurated as president, Arango stepped into this new position, and Árbenz was sworn in as defense minister. Government of Juan José Arevalo described his ideology as spiritual socialism. Quote, "He was anti-Marxist, and believed in a capitalist society that was regulated to ensure that its benefits went to the entire population." Arevalo's ideology was reflected in the new constitution that the Guatemalan Assembly ratified soon after his inauguration, which was one of the most progressive in Latin America. It mandated suffrage for all but illiterate women, a decentralization of power, and provisions for a multi-party system. Communist parties were, however, forbidden. Arevalo implemented social reforms, including minimum wage laws, increased educational funding, near universal suffrage, and labor reforms. The benefits of these reforms were largely restricted to the upper middle classes and did little for the peasant agricultural laborers who made up the majority of the population. Despite the fact that his reforms were based on liberalism and capitalism, he was viewed with suspicion by the United States, and would later be portrayed by the U.S. government as a communist. When Árbenz was sworn in as defense minister under President Arevalo, he became the first to hold the portfolio, since it had previously been known as the Ministry of War. In the fall of 1947, Árbenz, as defense minister, objected to several workers' deportation after they had been accused of being communists. Well-known communist José Manuel Fortuny was intrigued by this action and decided to visit him, and found Árbenz to be different from the stereotypical Central American military officer. That first meeting was followed by others until Árbenz invited Fortuny to his house, where discussions and conversations became common and usually extended 4 hours. Like Árbenz, Fortuny was inspired by a fierce nationalism and a burning desire to improve the conditions of the Guatemalan people, and like Árbenz, he sought answers in Marxist theory. This relationship would strongly influence him in the future. On the 16th of December 1945, Arevalo was incapacitated for a while in a car accident. The leaders of the Revolutionary Action Party, which was the party that supported the government, were afraid that Arango would take the opportunity to launch a coup, and so struck a deal with him, which later came to be known as the Pacto del Barranco. Under the terms of this pact, Arango agreed to refrain from seizing power with the military. In return, the PAR agreed to support Arana's candidacy in the next presidential election, scheduled for November 1950. Arevalo himself recovered swiftly, but was forced to support the agreement. However, by 1949 the National Renovation Party and the PA were both openly hostile to Arevalo due to his lack of support for labor rights. The leftist parties decided to back Árbenz instead, as they believed that only a military officer could defeat Arevalo. In 1947, Arevalo had demanded that certain labor leaders be expelled from the country. Árbenz vocally disagreed with Arevalo, and the latter's intervention limited the number of deportees. The land reforms brought about by the Arevalo administration threatened the interests of the landed elite, who sought a candidate who would be more amenable to the terms. They began to prop up Arevalo as a figure of resistance to Arevalo's reforms. The summer of 1949 saw intense political conflict in the councils of the Guatemalan military between supporters of Arevalo and of Árbenz, over the choice of Arana's successor. On the 16th of July 1949, Arevalo delivered an ultimatum to Arevalo, demanding the expulsion of all of Árbenz supporters from the cabinet and the military. He threatened a coup if his demands were not met. Arevalo informed Árbenz and other progressive leaders of the ultimatum, who all agreed that Arevalo should be exiled. 2 days later, Arevalo and Arevalo had another meeting. On the way back, Arana's convoy was intercepted by a small force led by Árbenz. A shootout ensued, killing 3 men, including Arevalo. Historian Piero Gligeses stated that Árbenz probably had orders to capture, rather than to kill, Arevalo. Arana's supporters in the military rose up in revolt, but they were leaderless, and by the next day the rebels asked for negotiations. The coup attempt left approximately 150 dead and 200 wounded. Árbenz and a few other ministers suggested that the entire truth be made public. However, they were overruled by the majority of the cabinet, and Arevalo made a speech suggesting that Arevalo had been killed for refusing to lead a coup against the government. Árbenz kept his silence over the death of Arevalo until 1968, refusing to speak out without first obtaining Arevalo's consent. He tried to persuade Arevalo to tell the entire story when the two met in Montevideo in the 1950s, during their exile. However, Arevalo was unwilling, and Árbenz did not press his case. 1950 election. Árbenz's role as defense minister had already made him a strong candidate for the presidency, and his firm support of the government during the 1949 uprising further increased his prestige. In 1950, the economically moderate Partido de Integridad Nacional announced that Árbenz would be its presidential candidate in the upcoming election. This announcement was quickly followed by endorsements from most parties on the left, including the influential PA, as well as from labor unions. Árbenz carefully chose the PAN as the party to nominate him. Based on the advice of his friends and colleagues, he believed it would make his candidacy appear more moderate. Árbenz himself resigned his position as defense minister on the 20th of February, and declared his candidacy for the presidency. Arevalo wrote him an enthusiastic personal letter in response. However, Arevalo himself only endorsed him reluctantly, and is thought to have preferred his friend Giordani. It was only the support Árbenz had, and the impossibility of Giordani being elected, that led to Arevalo deciding to support Árbenz. Prior to his death, Arevalo had planned to run in the upcoming 1950 presidential elections. His death left Árbenz without any serious opponents in the elections. Árbenz had only a couple of significant challenges in the election, in a field of 10 candidates. One of these was George Garcia Hernandez, who was supported by some members of the upper middle class who felt the revolution had gone too far. Another was Miguel Ydígoras Fuentes, who had been a general under Ubico, and who had the support of the hardline opponents of the revolution. During his campaign, Árbenz promised to continue and expand the reforms begun under Arevalo. Árbenz was expected to win the election comfortably, because he had the support of both the major political parties of the country, as well as that of the labor unions which campaigned heavily on his behalf. In addition to political support, Árbenz had great personal appeal. He was described as having an engaging personality and a vibrant voice. Árbenz's wife Maria also campaigned with him. Despite her wealthy upbringing, she had made an effort to speak for the interests of the Mayan peasantry, and had become a national figure in her own right. Árbenz's two daughters also occasionally made public appearances with him. The election was held on 15 November 1950, and Árbenz won more than 60% of the vote, in elections that were largely free and fair with the exception of the disenfranchisement of illiterate female voters. Árbenz got more than 3 times as many votes as the runner-up, Miguel Ydígoras Fuentes. Fuentes claimed that electoral fraud benefited Árbenz. However, scholars have pointed out that while fraud may possibly have given Árbenz some of his votes, it was not the reason that he won the election. Árbenz's promise of land reform played a large role in ensuring his victory. The election of Árbenz alarmed U.S. State Department officials, who stated that Arangya has always represented the only positive conservative element in the Arevalo administration, that his death would strengthen leftist materially, and that developments forecast sharp leftist trend within the government. Árbenz was inaugurated as president on 15 March 1951.